Welcome to today's webinar on local plans and climate change. The speakers today include Isabella Krabbe, who is RTPI's Climate Change Research Officer, Sam Hunter-Jones, a lawyer from an environmental law charity called Client Earth, James Shorten, who works for Terra Perma Geo with 30 years experience on the planning system and sustainable development, and Emma Davies, who's Principal Sustainability Officer for the Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service. My name is Dawn de Vries and I'm Chair of the RTPI Southwest for 2020 and a Principal Planning Officer for Sedgemoor District Council. I'll be hosting today's event and coordinating the Q&A at the end of the presentation. So just in respect of housekeeping and to help you get the most out of the session, I'm just going to cover a couple of quick points. So as delegates, you've all been muted. If you have any questions, then please raise these via the question box in the GoToWebinar panel, which may be on the right or the top of your screen. The speaker's presentation will run for approximately an hour before we come to the Q&A. We will get to as many of these as we can, but any questions not answered will be considered after the session and responses be emailed out to all applicants. A copy of the presentation will be included as a handout for you to download from the GoToWebinar panel towards the end of the session. And if you personally lose connection during the session, please try rejoining via the link emailed to you from GoToWebinar. You can increase your Wi-Fi connectivity by disconnecting all other devices from Wi-Fi. If a speaker loses connectivity, then please wait in the webinar, but do keep an eye on your emails in case we have to relaunch the session with a new link. So now the formalities are done, I'd like to introduce you to Isabella Krabbe, who will be presenting on transforming to a greener planning. Over to you, Isabel.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining this webinar and thank you for the introduction, Dawn. As Dawn mentioned, I will be giving you a brief overview of the potential of our planning system to guide our transition to net zero and to roll out adaptation measures. And towards the end, I'll pick up on some points from the planning white paper and discuss whether or not that's going to facilitate the planning system to meet our ambitions for net zero. So the potential of planning. The fact that almost everything that gets built has to pass through the planning system presents a clear opportunity for the planning system to ensure that nothing gets built without demonstrating how it can fit into a net zero future. As Sam will go into in more detail following this presentation, the ability to act and mitigate climate change is backed up by strong legal and policy requirements. In June 2019, Parliament passed legislation requiring the UK to reach net zero by 2050. Local authorities across the UK have responded to this, with 74% of local authorities, last time I checked, declaring a climate emergency and many setting targets to reach net zero before 2050. Reaching net zero is going to require the engagement of a huge array of stakeholders, and here's just a selection of the different stakeholders that are involved in local plan making and helping meet climate targets. So working along with the TCPA, last year we produced a guide for local authorities called Rising to the Climate Challenge, a guide for local authorities, and a link to this will be sent out to you after the webinar. It included best practice and some principles on local plan making and climate change. So I've put a couple of the principles up there. Principle 1, local plans should be based on a strong and precise policy setting out how emissions will be reduced in line with carbon budgets. And Principle 2, local authorities should have an effective monitoring regime in place to understand if these policies to reduce emissions are actually working to do this. There's a couple of really useful tools when thinking about local plans and reducing emissions. And there's a couple of them here. One is called SCATTER, which stands for Setting Area-Based Targets and Trajectories for Emissions Reductions. And then there's another one produced by the Tyndall Centre. And essentially, these help local authorities set inventories for emissions reductions. So you can choose your local authority area and you can see what your emissions reductions need to be for your local area. So it's essentially a carbon budget, but it's specific to your local authority area. The guide that we produced also contains information on local plans and climate adaptation. So I've pulled out the principles here. Principle 1, local plans need to consider adaptation across spatial scales. So from the kind of micro building scale all the way up to spatial future patterns of development. And principle 2, the time horizons that we're considering for these future impacts of climate should be 50 to 100 years horizons in terms of where new development is being located. And I've pulled out a few useful tools here as well for planners when thinking about climate adaptation within plan making. So the first one here has been produced by C40 Cities, and it's a heat resilient cities toolkit, which helps planners and built environment professionals quantify the health and economic benefits of urban heat adaptation actions. So that helps build a bit more of a kind of business case for why you're introducing these adaptation measures. The next one, probably a lot of you have heard of, is Climate Just, which was developed in collaboration with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And it's a way of designing socially just responses to the impact of extreme events, specifically for flooding. And on Climate Just, you can get maps, neighbourhood level maps, which show areas of socioeconomic deprivation, and overlays these with areas that are vulnerable to flooding. So you can see where this kind of socioeconomic vulnerability intersects with the vulnerability to the impacts of flooding, and where there is most need for these adaptation measures to be rolled out. Resin is another useful tool which allows planners to evaluate adaptation measures and tailor specific adaptation measures to a city or an area. Earlier this year at the RTPI, we produced this index of climate tools. So it's not exhaustive, unfortunately, but it's a list of kind of, I think there's 18 climate adaptation and mitigation tools there, and you can see whether you can use them in your development management decisions or in plan making. And in the middle there, the green dots also show if there's an element of climate justice within the tool, so whether you can consider socioeconomic vulnerability intersecting with vulnerability towards climate change. And this is just a photo of the front cover of the guide, which will be linked in the handout. And there'll also be a link to the climate tools, which is available on the RTPI website through a Learn module. So moving on to the planning white paper, which sets out this kind of new approach to plan making. But does the white paper actually allow local plans to deliver their potential for climate adaptation and mitigation? I'll give you a spoiler alert. No, in its current draft state, we don't think it provides the clarity, ambition, or robust policy which is needed. There are, however, some opportunities within the white paper. So I'll take a couple of examples and I'll go through the opportunities and also some of the caveats. So one of the big proposals in the white paper is for these kind of simplified local plans. So they want the role of local plans to be focusing on identifying 3 categories of land: growth, renewal, and protect. So what does this mean in practice? Essentially, general development management policies will be set out at a national level in the NPPF, with local plans setting site-specific requirements alongside locally produced design codes. The white paper also sets out a vision for local plans to be more visual, data and map-based in nature. So the opportunities here for delivering on climate action is, we think that basing plans on data and visuals can help engage a wider section of the public in plan making. And help them understand the development plan a bit more and kind of bring them along on this journey to net zero. And setting out kind of the general development management policies in the NPPF will also help provide a robust standardised approach and could help set out a clear pathway for carbon reduction within planning. However, we also think that local authorities, it's really important for them to be able to retain the flexibility to go above standards set out in the NPPF So these kind of standards shouldn't be a ceiling, they should almost act as a floor, showing the kind of minimum standards that are required. Design codes seem to place in the white paper this kind of massive emphasis on a fast track for beauty rather than a fast track for sustainable climate-proof design, which prioritises emission reductions through fabric efficiency and a recognition of the impact of embodied carbon. Again, the future home standard is mentioned in the white paper, but it still relies on the decarbonisation of the grid for homes that are getting built today to reach net zero, rather than doing this through the design of homes that are being built. The land use designations, sorry, that's got to stay on the slide. The land use designations are also very simplistic, these growth, renewal and protect areas. And we think that we can go a lot further to deliver environmental net gain and align with the objectives of the 25-year environment plan, especially by integrating nature recovery across 3 zones rather than seeing it as kind of isolated in this protect zone. We also think that there isn't really evidence of how the categories or the land use designations are going to be allocated to reinforce sustainable development patterns or further integrate land use and transport planning, which is needed to reduce emissions. Another large change that's proposed in the planning white paper is a single test of sustainable development. So it will replace the test of soundness, including the sustainability appraisal, with this one single test. And there's an opportunity here to streamline the process, which is obviously a positive. And it will also allow us to consider a wide range of economic, social and environmental issues at the front end of the planning process. However, there is very little detail as to what is actually going to be in this test of sustainable development, and the devil really will be in the detail as to whether or not this test is going to be sufficient. We have a couple of points on what should be required in the test. The test should not be passed if the local plan does not deliver on the local carbon budget for the area. The test should be consultative and show how local people have been engaged in the process. The test should also be supported by a strong evidence base based on up-to-date local data. And the test must also be supported by a revised national planning policy framework, which contains much clearer outcomes for plans with measurable standards and targets. And reporting against these desired outcomes should be made public. So earlier in the year, we published this measuring planning outcomes work that we did with Kevin Murray Associates, and it basically sets out a framework for how we can measure planning outcomes aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's also a link to that in the handout being sent out. And it's a kind of a handbook and an Excel sheet and this research report, which is a really useful resource. And a glaring gap in the white paper is this kind of lack of mention of strategic planning, which is going to be really essential in building climate resilience across city regions. The transition to net zero and rolling out adaptation measures will require strategic planning across local authority boundaries with early engagement, again, from a wide range of stakeholders. The importance of this strategic level has been highlighted in a recent research paper, Strategic Planning for Climate Resilience, which explored the role of Liverpool Combined Authority in delivering climate adaptation measures. The white paper seeks to abolish the duty to cooperate and is largely silent on strategic planning. In our response to the white paper, we recommended that green growth boards are developed to help guide investment and ensure that plans can be assessed against wider economic, infrastructure, and environmental strategies, and provide this platform for a wide range of stakeholders to engage early enough on a strategic level. Oops, sorry. So funding and resourcing. The total expenditure on planning policy has actually fallen by 22% in England since 2010. It's fallen by more than 40% in Scotland since 2009 and 50% in Wales. And in order to deliver climate action and the ambitions in the white paper, the planning system obviously needs to be resourced to do so. The white paper did promise a, quote, comprehensive resources and skills strategy for the planning sector to support the implementation of the reforms. And we called for 500 million to be invested in the planning system over the next 4 years, with 67 million set aside for climate action and resourcing a full-time equivalent planner to work on climate change in local authorities. However, the government has recently announced just 12 million to support its planning reform agenda. With the ambitious plans recently set out in the CCC's 6th carbon budget for reducing emissions, we don't think that this 12 million is going to be enough to resource the planning system to deliver the ambitious measures needed. For those of you interested, we've recently worked with Vivid Economics to set out a business case for investing in planning called Invest and Prosper. That's also linked in the handout. And it shows, it kind of gives a monetary value to the health, social and climate benefits that are delivered by planning. Thank you all very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions at the end of the presentations. I'll hand back to Dawn.
Thank you very much, Isabella. It was really interesting to see the range of climate change tools coming online to assist in the development management process, so thank you for that. I'll now pass on to Sam Hunter-Jones, who will present on the legal obligation to climate-proof local plans. So over to you, Sam.
Thanks very much, Dawn and Isabella. So that's what I'm going to talk about, some of the law and policy in this area. And I'll talk a bit about our work at Client Earth that's focused on this issue, as well as looking at some of the recent developments, including advice to the government from the Committee on Climate Change, talking through the law and policy in this area and looking at the kinds of results you get when that law and policy is complied with at the end. So just to start, I thought I'd check everyone's perception of where we are at the moment. And I had a poll, just a sort of simple yes, no. Do you think local plans are doing enough to support the transition to net zero emissions? So I'll just wait for everyone to give their views on that. Right, so that's a really helpful confirmation for me that we're on the same page. There's a lot that needs to be done to really enable the transition to net zero when it comes to local planning. So trying to get slides right. Yeah. So the work we've been doing. So Client Earth, just for those of you not aware of who we are, we're an environmental law charity that works on a number of different issues related to the environment, environmental protection, and I'm working in the climate team. And one of our focuses has been on planning, because we see that as a really important area to facilitate the transition to clean and sustainable communities and forms of energy over the coming decades. And in England, at least, we've sensed that there was a real shortfall in action and compliance with the current existing legal and policy obligations in the development of local plans. And we wrote to the 100 or so English councils that were currently working on new local plans in 2019, last year, September, reminding them of their legal obligations. We've since followed up with consultation responses and submissions to local plan examinations. We've also been giving high-level guidance, working with the RTPI and TCPA and the Centre for Sustainable Energy and others as part of that work. And so moving on to the Committee on Climate Change's recent report on the 6th carbon budget, which was advising the government on what they needed to do to put the UK on a trajectory in line with net zero. That advice was published last week, and And it's the first budget, it's important to note, that was set under the new net zero target, and really shows a step change in ambition that the UK needs to make. It highlights transport and buildings as areas that really need attention, with emissions in those areas really flatlining or even increasing over the last 10 years. And they're, of course, really important areas and types of and sectors that local planning has an influence on. And they also produced a standalone report on what local authorities can be doing in terms of climate action and emissions reduction, and included specific recommendations on local planning, both in terms of talking to central government, in terms of national policy, but also at the local level as well. And so I think it was interesting to see that they came up with a percentage of local emissions that they thought local authorities had influence over, and I'd be interested in your perception of that as well. And I've got another poll that should come up on the screen now. So yeah, what approximate percentage of local emissions did the committee assess local authorities as having influence over? 25%, 33%, 50%, or 65%? Well, that's interesting. So the hive mind of our audience has got the answer right. It was 33%. Obviously, that's one figure and way of looking at things, and it may be that there are other ways of assessing that. But I thought it was an interesting and sort of significant level of influence that they assessed. So looking at the specific areas of local plan policy that they addressed in that report. Sorry, there's a delay on the slides. Yeah, on sustainable transport, they emphasised that really connecting new development to sustainable transport and related infrastructure needs to become the norm, not the exception, which is all too often not the case. And really looking at making sure that that local plans support a modal shift away from cars to walking, cycling, public transport, and making sure that they're linked to already viable existing public transport routes. And I think it's interesting to note that they emphasise the need for that modal shift, irrespective of the anticipated move towards electric vehicles over the next 2 decades in the UK. And they came up again with an approximate percentage of the car trips that, as a bare minimum, they say needed to shift to sustainable forms of transport. And I have a final poll just to gauge your views on that issue as well, and what you think they thought as a minimum would be needed in all areas to get the UK in the right direction to meet the 6th carbon budget and the net zero target. Okay, so actually the poll has suggested that it was 60%, when actually the CCC suggested that it was 35%. But I think it's worth noting that in a lot of areas, so urban areas in particular, that figure is likely to need to be much higher than 35%. And on the area of energy efficiency, low carbon heat, the CCC suggested that really needs to be a move to imposing requirements for highly energy efficient buildings, and suggested that local planning authorities in developing their new local plans needed to look to exceed current building standards. And in the context of renewables, they suggested that local plans need to be really take a much more positive, proactive approach to supporting renewable energy generation and storage, so things like batteries. And they emphasised the way in which the planning system is currently really acting as a block to new onshore wind development. Obviously, that stems in part from policies at the national level, but also there's a lack of action in terms of the way in which local authorities are planning for onshore wind, and that is preventing the industry from developing the way that it should and growing. And that's despite the fact the government are looking to subsidise that form of energy in the future. So that's one area that they've emphasised needs to change. So I'm going to talk now about the legal and policy framework and to talk through that. Essentially, just as an overview, I mean, what we say that means is that they mean that local plans, as Isabella talked about earlier with those two principles, they need to have emissions reductions objectives integrated across all aspects of plan policy, and those policies need to be justified by reference to their expected consistency and contribution to wider national, regional climate objectives. And in practice, given the long lifespan of new development, really the starting point needs to be whether or not these policies will enable, as far as possible, patterns and types of development that are consistent with net zero. So you're hopefully all familiar with section 19(1)(a) of the 2004 Planning Act that was introduced in 2008 alongside the Climate Change Act, which states that development plan documents must, taken as a whole, include policies designed to secure the development and use of land in the local planning authority's area contributes to the mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. And that obligation is also supplemented by the Strategic Environmental Assessment, SEA regulations, which govern largely the way that sustainability appraisal is conducted. And that really bolsters that obligation under the Planning Act and talks about the way that the SEA process, if you look at the guidance from the Commission at the time, talks about the fact that the appraisal needs to describe whether or not the proposed plan policies facilitate or contradict the achievement of those wider climate objectives. And in terms of national planning policy, there's some really strong support for robust policy on emissions reduction. So it talks about the need for radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and the way that planning can support that, and also the need for proactive policies that are in line with the objectives and provisions of the Climate Change Act. The planning practice guidance also talks about addressing climate change being a core land use planning principle, that section 19(1)(a) in compliance with that obligation will be assessed at examination, that sustainability appraisal needs to inform strategies that will actually be in line with the targets under the Climate Change Act, and talks about the need for robust evaluation of future emissions. So where are we now? I think in terms of the position since we started talking to and engaging with local authorities on this issue, we've seen some really positive signs of improvement. I think it's fair to say that those can be quite isolated, and that the picture is still far from perfect in a lot of areas. And we often see some clearly flawed and bad practice persisting in a lot of local plans. So a lot of work to do still. So in terms of signs of improvement, I think it's been really encouraging to see some local plans getting from the outset the concept of what's required and the key requirements in norm policy right. So talking about a national requirement to future-proof against climate change, including reducing carbon emissions, sustainable construction, and promoting sustainable modes of transport. The need for local plans to demonstrate how their policies are in line with the targets under the Climate Change Act, understanding whether or not those policies are consistent with the trajectory needed to meet that target, and also the way that councils are approaching assessing the climate impacts of their policies. So trying to maximise local action through planning policy, and having that as the starting point, and having a proper comprehensive evidence base to inform the development of plan policy. And we often see, when those starting points and the process is framed in the right way from the outset, you see some good policy coming out of that. Whether it's looking at trying to establish the highest viable energy efficiency standards for new homes, or looking to have really strong policies that promote and maximise the shift to sustainable transport modes. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to get the monitoring framework right too. And so some example indicates the kind of issues and areas that you can monitor in local plans. But I think that, the key point is that in the evidence base and overall in the development plan, there need to be some specific targets that are actually looking at the long-term objective you're trying to achieve and that are consistent with a comprehensive evidence base. You have to include an example there in terms of sustainable transport, but the key point is that there's no point having a meaningless monitoring target that talks about a year-on-year increase or decrease when actually you're looking at eliminating emissions entirely over the long term. So some examples of the kind of bad practice we continue to see, local council simply asserting that because a policy has an impact on or relates to emissions reduction in some way, that meets their obligations under section 19(1)A and the NPPF. There's often a failure to recognise the need for local policy to support and enable delivery of the national net zero target and wider policy, and sort of failure to identify all of the opportunities open to local authorities in developing local plans. And crucially, there's no assessment often of what good looks like locally, so what could be achieved and whether or not policies can be expected to bring about those outcomes. As I mentioned, the monitoring indicators and targets are often far too vague and ineffective in this area. One important aspect, obviously, is sustainability appraisal, and too often we see that the approach is framed around the wrong questions in a way that really sort of masks and distracts from the key issues. So there's an example conclusion on the slide there saying that the overall effect of the plan on the baseline is small but mixed nonetheless, and really that follows from an approach which doesn't look at whether or not the plan policy is consistent with wider planning and climate objectives, but just looks at climate change impacts from a global perspective and says that it's all really too complicated to assess. And another thing that you often see is in that sort of sustainability appraisal approach is that plus 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 minus 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 approach is that you see sites being judged in a way that allows a minor positive aspect in terms of emissions to mask a serious fundamental flaw in another area. So a site in an entirely unsustainable location is given a positive tick alongside climate change due to it having some form of on-site renewable provision. And I think that's something that clearly needs to change. And so looking forward, I think Isabella's already talked about the white paper reforms, and those are clearly very important, but it's hard to know precisely where those will end up ultimately. And I think in the meantime, it's critical that we enforce the existing requirements. We've already had millions of homes built since the Climate Change Act was passed in 2008, and many of those will either be built in entirely inappropriate locations or have really poor energy efficiency standards that will need to be rectified and corrected over the coming years. And really, we need to avoid that if we're going to support and deliver on the net zero target and the challenge ahead. So I'll leave it there, but look forward to discussing further in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Sam. It's good to see that there is some improvement, but it might be interesting to focus on examples of best practice later. I'm now going to be handing over to James Shorten for a presentation on how the planning system can respond to the climate emergency using a case study of Devon carbon plan. So over to you, James. Thank you.
Okay, so the main reason I'm here today is because I'm a member of the Devon Net Zero Task Force. I'm the planner on the task force, and we've just produced the Devon Carbon Plan. And we just produced the Devon Carbon Plan in December as a result of about 18 months of work, which obviously was interrupted by COVID. So I'm going to do two things today. I'll outline some of what's in the plan, but I also want to give you a flavour of the discussions and debate that led to what was in the plan, wrestling with this, existential issue of climate change. First of all, I want to just visit sustainable development. We use it as a shorthand for all sorts of things these days, but I think it's really important to recognise that essentially it's a failed concept. When I began my planning career over 30 years ago, we had the Rio Summit and the Brundtland definition of sustainable development which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And we have to, I think, face the fact that we've completely blown that. The ability of other people of our generation to meet their needs and of future generations to meet their own needs in terms of climate capacity has gone. And we face real jeopardy that the future, unless we buckle down very heavily on net zero by 2050, will be heavily compromised for future generations. So I want to introduce you to the concept, if you haven't heard it already, of regenerative development, rather than simply seeking to keep enough of the Earth's resources so that future generations will be okay. We need to rebuild the Earth's resources. And this is a concept partly built into nature recovery, but also the sequestration element of the climate emergency is very much about that as well. We do, and this has already been trailed, this quote from the MPPF, have increasingly strong national policy, though clearly there are concerning issues about it, how it joins up. But the Devon Carbon Plan has bit down very heavily on the requirements in the MPPF to contribute to radical reductions in greenhouse emissions through the way we shape places. But I would ask you just to reflect for a moment on whether anything in your work is really doing that at the moment, because I don't think so. I don't think the planning system has yet to deliver those radical reductions in emissions. We also need to address this issue of technical fix versus behaviour change. There's a heavy amount of statistical information behind the Devon Carbon Plan, mainly produced by the University of Exeter. And that shows us broadly that we can only get about 50% of what we need from technical fix. So that's insulating buildings, changing fuels and so on. The other 50% has to come from behaviour change. And this is very much a planning matter because, of course, at the heart of what we do is the notion of we're trying to engender different forms of behaviour to produce different outcomes. The closest we've really come in the past is this phrase, the reducing the need to travel, which we had in PPG 13 and back in the 90s and have inherited ever since. But again, that's been a really weak policy instrument because as we see from data from things like the National Travel Survey, yes, since the 90s, trips have flatlined and then drifted down again, but the number of miles traveled has gone up enormously. So we've not really strongly managed to reduce the need to travel, that phrase, because, and it's an obvious one, there are other things going on. Chiefly that the cost of motoring has become cheaper in real terms compared to that of public transport and so on. So our ability, I think my point here is not to rest back on notions like reducing the need to travel is enough. We actually need to reduce travel, and we need to reduce motor travel, and we need to discourage it through future planning decisions, and otherwise we won't achieve what we need to in terms of outcomes. And this is one for all of us as planners, and I've had some quite strained but ultimately productive conversations with all of the planners across the Devon strategic authorities. Ultimately, looking back at what we've done over the last 30 years of our work, be that in policy or development management or whatever, we need to recognise that it's not been enough, it's insufficient in terms of achieving the outcomes we're now asked to achieve, which is radical reductions in greenhouse emissions. I mean, reaching net zero is phenomenally hard. The UK fires report indicates that without the technical fix issues, which are things like carbon capture and storage, it's virtually impossible. And yet we're relying on technologies that don't even exist at the moment. So for the planners, this is either dispiriting or it's deeply inspiring that finally our profession, which has been sort of reduced in what it has the ability to do, is coming of age and is critical, particularly because of its spatial focus, to achieving net zero if we can get there. And by the way, the Devon Carbon Plan wrestled with an earlier date, and although the authorities in Devon, some of them have picked 2035, 2040, we stuck with 2050 just because of the basic impossibility in technical terms of getting there any earlier. And I just wanted to throw up, this is the origin destination. No, it's not, beg your pardon. This is the car travel as the principal means of commuting to work data from the DataShine, this census data 2011 from DataShine, which is one of the London universities, produced a really nice visual representation of census data. This is Bristol, where I used to live. I'm speaking to you from Totnes today. And the green is higher proportion of car use for the commute. And what we see, if anybody Bristol, is the brightest green areas are all the areas where we've put the new housing over the last 20 and 30 years. So whilst we've had the requirement to reduce the need to travel, the outcome of our choices in terms of where we put new housing has actually increased actual car travel if we use travel to work by car as an indicator. But of course, we are captured by other decisions in the policy sphere which undermine what planners are trying to do. I'm not trying to suggest for a moment that planners have been doing things which are completely unhelpful. It's just other policy choices have just undermined and eroded what we try to do. So the second greatest contributor to global emissions over the last nearly 20 years is SUVs. And in the UK, we know that SUVs, the increase in emissions from SUVs has entirely cancelled out those of electric vehicles, the gains we get there. So there's a need for joining up here. And as I'll come to in a bit, the planning system offers you a unique ability to join up spatially and across various forms of activity that doesn't exist in anywhere else in the policy world. So the Devon Carbon Plan, these are some of the headline issues. We know we need to maximize technical fixes, even though they don't give us everything we need. The Devon Carbon Plan recognizes behavior changes as a necessity. It's something we must achieve rather than we just wish to nudge. It recognizes the importance of varying geography. Devon is about half rural. And so if we have an overtly urban focus in terms of, and I'm using the term deliberately, bearing in mind what I said earlier, that more sustainable is larger or urban, then we're effectively redacting half of Devon's population and the way in which they can help us achieve net zero. And policy needs to span all of the spatial system. And probably the best example of that is the notion of a land use framework, which is an organization of how the bits of land use which are not part of the planning system, i.e. agriculture and forestry principally, might be better joined up with the plans made by the planning system on the socioeconomic stuff. It's an idea that the RSA report on the future of farming first adopted, and it's very resonant for Devon, and we've proposed that this join between a land use framework necessary to look at things like sequestration, reforestation, nature recovery, is properly joined to a socioeconomic framework, which is that of the planning system, so that we don't have unintended consequences, and we maximize, it's a jargon term, but it's used a lot now, co-benefits. So these are some quotes from the Devon Carbon Plan, just to show you what we've been up to. And it's quite strong on the role of planning. So it recognises there's a clear need for reorganisation of society towards net zero, and these are the headlines that the planning system can contribute to. Ensuring that all new development strongly contributes to the transformation required to hit net zero. Re-emphasising the importance of place, of people's connection to a location, and that's also connected to the idea of relocalisation, which is below. Spatial planning and transport need to be better linked, and relocalisation should be an organising principle wherever it can achieve it, assist the achievement of net zero. I guess we've always kind of been looking at relocalization and intending for it to occur, but it's quite a controversial point to make, saying, well, we just need to live smaller lives and more localized lives, because it can feel like stepping backwards. The issue, of course, in all of this is, what does a better life look like under net zero, rather than assuming that a life under net zero will necessarily be worse. And also, this is Devon's specific point, but I'm sure it's shared with many areas of England. Net zero needs to recognise that the importance of rural areas in delivering net zero, not only for their communities, but the growing importance of the resources and services they provide for larger towns and cities. So all of us on the webinar, about a third of our carbon footprint will be food. Relocalisation of food systems and markets is important, but also ecosystem services, sequestration, and so on. They're critical, essentially rural things that are provided for the overall mix by rural and urban can't do. So to, again, integrate that thinking into planning and support them where we can. So a more balanced emphasis between spatial planning for rural and urban areas. That doesn't just mean more development in rural areas, it means much more thought about the development we need in rural areas to assist the overall system to transition to lower emissions. Couple of the recommendations: local plans enable plans to demonstrate how they will shape places in ways that contribute to radical reductions in greenhouse emissions as a primary planning objective. So we're suggesting that this is the lead objective for all local plans. And secondly, it's been mentioned already, you know, we have this high ambition in the NPPF. We don't have a lot of detail in terms of how to do that. So we're also in the Devon Carbon Plan acknowledging that some of the things we wish to do will rely on national action. So we need greater guidance on what that is, how to shape places that contribute to radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. A point we discussed, it doesn't fully feature in the Devon Carbon Plan, but it's one I wanted to make to you because I think it's important, is that new development needs to be transformative, not incremental. It's not enough for new development to, in itself, just be net zero and wash its own face. When we have the potential for new development to transform how the whole system that it's part of, the urban system, the rural system, by going beyond simply in itself being net zero. And there are ways to regard this. One of them would be there is probably a significant cohort of the population who are interested in going car free, in leading much more localized lives. If we provide development designed to make that easy rather than hard, we can achieve greater benefits than just achieving net zero on otherwise normal forms of development. I wanted to end with a little planning reference. Of course, this is Ebenezer Howard's Garden City model, where he was trying to find a kind of meeting point between the town and the country, and that was the Garden City, where the benefits of both occurred, and there's few of the disadvantages we were faced with. I've cheekily produced a kind of modern, very much more simplified version of this, because I think we and I mean the planning profession stands at something of a turning point here if we choose to take it, where that relationship of sort of compromise and balance is over. We have two things which cannot be resolved. We have essentially a consumption crisis here. The climate emergency and the ecological emergencies are both emergencies of overconsumption, and there's no ducking that. We have a finite planet, and the kind of notion in those three spheres of sustainability, the Venn diagram, that somehow in the middle is the answer is no longer the case. We have to reduce our consumption in order to fit within the capacity of the planet. Otherwise, we'll run out. You know, there's no planet B and all that. Those arguments. So rather than people where will they go, I think we have this agenda now. The biosphere, will it collapse? And the answer is that we need to recognize that we need to live lighter, we need to live smaller, we need to find more regenerative patterns of development. And the planning system, as I hope you've seen, is a crucial agent in orchestrating that wider picture. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, James. Love the visual. Thank you. I'm just going to pass now to our last speaker just before the Q&As. So it's Emma Davies, who's going to be presenting on carbon budgeting and local plans with a focus on Great Cambridgeshire's local plan. Thank you very much, Emma.
Lovely, thank you, Dawn. So yes, I'm going to touch on some of the work that we've been doing in Greater Cambridge, which is an area that covers Cambridge City and South Cambridgeshire District Council. And I'm going to touch on some of the work that we've been doing as part of our new local plan. So if we go into my next slide, I thought I would start, and James has already touched on some of this, but I thought I'd start with why planning actually has a role to play in responding to the climate emergency. So the Committee on Climate Change have identified a range of measures that we need to implement to get to net zero. So we've got resource and energy efficiency and reducing demand for energy across society. As James has already said, there's societal choices and behaviour change that we need to implement that will lead to a lower demand for carbon intensive activities. Extensive electrification, particularly around transport and heating. There's the hydrogen economy that needs to be developed. And then there's also other elements like carbon capture and storage. So it's quite a complex picture getting to net zero carbon. James has referenced, Devon's decision not to go for a date before kind of 2050 because of the complexity and some of the difficulties in getting to net zero carbon. But for me, I think, the planning system is incredibly well placed to help facilitate a huge range of aspects of zero carbon. Behaviour change is a huge element in this, and the pie chart on this slide is taken from one of the reports from the Committee on Climate Change, and this quite clearly shows that 38% of the emissions reduction that we need will come from low carbon technologies or fuels, but the rest of the reduction actually does depend either solely on societal or behavioural change, or the grey part of this pie chart measures in combination with technology and behavioural change. And it's that grey bit of the pie chart that really interests me, and really, I think for me, shows where planning has got a significant role to play, because planning, it's not about housing numbers, which you could be forgiven for thinking if you kind of read a lot of the press releases about planning, but planning is about placemaking. It is about shaping places so that people can more easily make that transition to a low carbon society. And as Sam has already touched on, Client Earth have written to over 100 local planning authorities about their role in responding to the climate emergency. Greater Cambridge was one of those areas that received that letter, and actually that letter for us was really helpful because it really clearly spelled out the kind of legislative background that we were all working to. So if we move to my next slide. So now just thinking about, so how do we actually kind of move and what do we need to do to kind of get to net zero carbon through planning? So in Greater Cambridge, we're just now starting work on our new local plan. We started work about a year ago, and we have, as part of that, committed to introducing net zero carbon. So climate change, the image on this slide, it's taken from our first conversation document, which is kind of like our issues and options report. And climate change is identified as one of the 4 key themes for the new local plan. So how the plan could contribute to achieving net zero carbon and the mitigation and adaptation measures that should be required through new development. And 73% of the respondents to this consultation supported our key themes, with climate change being one of the top themes for those responding. So what does a net zero carbon local plan policy, or indeed a suite of policies, actually look like? I think it's fair to say that to date, the furthest most local planning authorities have gone is considering energy use in buildings, and many of you will be familiar with the kind of Merton rule type policies that require a certain percentage of energy to come from renewable energy, or setting certain levels of carbon reduction. But what's very clear now is that doesn't really fully reflect what is required for us to get to net zero carbon. And you add to that the research from the Town and Country Planning Association, which has found that policies related to climate resilience are also very lacking in local plans. I think it's very fair to say that our policies are going to look very, very different in the future and consider a wide range of issues. So if we move to my next slide, the first step for us and for all local planning authorities in kind of thinking about how you develop those policies is the need for a robust evidence base for net zero carbon. So in Greater Cambridge, we are working with bioregional and Etude at the moment to develop that evidence base, to develop the policies that will enable the built environment to transition to net zero carbon. There are a number of key tasks involved in this work. So the first task is the development of a position paper, which sets out the role of planning in delivering net zero carbon, identifying the areas that the plan can and cannot influence. We've then got task B, which is an assessment of the carbon implications of our spatial strategy. So where we focus development. And the image on this slide is one of the graphs from this assessment. And this shows a comparison of the different elements of our spatial strategy. And it gives consideration to building related emissions, so operational energy, embodied energy and transport. And it looks at the carbon emissions associated with those aspects across our different spatial strategy options. So what you can see from this slide, hopefully, is that actually one of the key areas for us to focus on, once we've introduced policies related to buildings, so policies to drive down energy demand, policies related to renewable energy, and policies related to embodied carbon, what that leaves us with, which is the purple on this chart, is the transport-related emissions, which we've already touched on in quite a few of the presentations today. Now, there is a lot that planning can do to help shift travel behaviours and really drive down the demand for private car use, but it still requires a significant behavioural change from people. So I would say that the work that's been undertaken by bioregional and Etude kind of takes a slightly precautionary approach on transport. I think a lot of people are pinning their hopes on electrification, but really what we need to be doing is driving down car use to start with. So for us, when we look at our spatial strategy, if we were to focus development in villages, for example, that would lead potentially to quite high emissions associated with transport. So we've got a quick poll for you, and I'm really interested to know whether any other local authorities or indeed any of the consultancies on this call have either done this sort of assessment or been involved in doing some work for local authorities. So if you could quickly complete this poll. I know there's a few people on the call from the Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service, so hopefully you'll be saying yes. There we go. So as I thought, and this is something that bioregional did look at, there aren't that many local authorities at the moment who have carried out this sort of assessment yet, but I think it is quite a useful exercise to undertake in getting us, getting an idea of the kind of wider role of planning in getting us to net zero carbon. So yeah, some of the other tasks that this piece of work is looking at as well. So we've got some work ongoing looking at the identification of carbon targets for inclusion in the local plan and the policy wording to ensure that planning plays its full role, thinking about issues beyond just energy use in buildings. We've also got a piece of work looking at the role of offsetting and what role, if any, carbon offsetting should play in new developments. So looking, if we were to go down the offsetting route, what should the cost per tonne of carbon be and what sort of projects should we identify? Another important area of work that we're looking at as well is looking at the role of planning in helping to support the infrastructure that we're going to need to support net zero carbon. And a significant area for us is looking at electricity infrastructure. The grid around Greater Cambridge is already pretty much at capacity at the moment, and we need to see quite rapid decarbonisation of heat and also transport. So we are looking at procuring a little piece of work to look at what sort of grid infrastructure is going to be needed to support the transition to net zero carbon, potentially looking at some more innovative approaches such as smart energy systems. So there's a role for infrastructure delivery plans and also the development of energy master plans for areas. And we've just actually started work on our first energy master plan for one of our big areas of redevelopment in Cambridge. So if we move to my next slide, this is just another graphic from the carbon assessment work of the spatial strategy. And what this provides is actually a comparison of the carbon emissions associated with our growth scenarios. So we have a minimum, a medium and a maximum growth scenario. And we've set those against the existing emissions across Greater Cambridge. We've included in there our existing developments that are already committed to. And then it looks at what additional emissions would come from the different growth scenarios, looking at a kind of business as usual approach, which is a kind of standard building regulations approach, and then also looking at an approach where we introduce some quite demanding zero carbon policies. And I think for me, it was really important for us to include this sort of graphic in this work, because it actually really does highlight that one of the big challenges we face does actually come from retrofitting, and how important it is for us not to add to that retrofit burden through new development. We've already got 28 million homes that need to be retrofitted in the country. Let's not go adding new developments to that list. So if we move to my next slide, I thought I would just end with a couple of slides which for me are kind of proper planning and getting the colouring pens out and kind of drawing and trying to communicate graphically what do we mean by net zero carbon communities. So the illustration on this slide is taken from our first conversation document on our new local plan. And what this is trying to show is that we need to move away from the bottom part of the image, which is a car-dominated fossil fuel society. And we need to move more towards the top image, which is where we've transitioned to clean sources of power, where public transport or walking and cycling is the first choice from getting to A to B, and where communities nurture the environment and biodiversity through enhanced green infrastructure. This idea of regenerative development that James was talking about, it's a really important idea that we need to get across. And then moving to my next slide, which is my penultimate slide. There's a lot of talk at the moment about net zero carbon, which is fantastic. We've had the energy white paper published day before yesterday, I believe it was as well. And it is really important that we reduce our carbon emissions. But I do fear sometimes that in all this talk about net zero carbon, we lose sight of the fact that our climate is already changing. And we need to make sure that as well as climate change mitigation and reducing emissions, we need to be integrating climate resilience into the design of the built environment, not the build environment, as I've put on this page. So this is a graphic from another of the planning documents that we are preparing at the moment, which is an area action plan for one of our big areas of redevelopment on the edge of Cambridge. And this is trying to show some of the measures that can be integrated into the design of new developments to make sure that they are resilient to our changing climate. So thinking about issues such as flood risk, thinking about issues such as heat in the built environment as well, which is one of the top climate risks for the UK, identified in the UK's climate change risk assessment. So we're looking at things like enhanced green infrastructure, the role of green roofs, making sure that buildings are designed to avoid the build-up of excess solar gain in the summer and the shoulder months, so in the spring and the autumn. So looking at architectural responses to that, looking at the importance of buildings that can have cross ventilation, and looking at integrating sustainable drainage systems into the built environment as well, not just to kind of store water at times of flood, but also to enable things like water reuse on quite a large scale. Water scarcity is one of the big issues that we're grappling with at the moment in Greater Cambridge. And then my next slide is just my contact details. So I think that's it from me. I welcome any questions, and I'll hand back to Dawn for the next bit of the presentations.
Thank you very much, Emma. I think being one of the first local authorities to grapple with understanding the evidence base for net zero carbon certainly has its challenges. I think if I can ask all the other speakers to put their videos on, we're going to move to the Q&A. So thank you for everyone who's posted a question already. If you've got any, feel free to post some more. We'll see how many we can get to, but we do have quite a number already. So if I could start with Isabella, please. So questions come through. What's the RTPI doing to encourage councils to declare climate emergencies and set up action plans? Just date to number of councils with such declarations is about 74%.
So we are producing a kind of number of policy and research reports where we try and, like the guide that I mentioned on Rising to the Climate Challenge that we worked with the TCPA and actually also Sam at Client Earth as well, and put it into that, you know, kind of giving guidance to local authorities on what they can do to actually reach net zero and best practice in terms of rolling out resilience measures as well. And there is some case studies in that guide, because I think rather than saying, you know, you need to declare a climate emergency, it's important to actually set out a path for how we're actually going to reach what's declared in the climate emergency and how we're going to reach net zero by 2030 or 2040 or 2050 or what the council's goal is.
I think clearly defining what it is and what that means and what actions you need to put into place actually makes it slightly more achievable, doesn't it?
And Dawn, sorry, I was just going to say as well, I'm working on a piece of research at the RTPI early next year on climate officers in local authorities and how they can work with planners to try and reach this target. So if anybody wants to get in contact with me to be part of that research, that would be much appreciated.
That's fine. So share it around, everybody. Next question to Sam, please. Are there any examples of local plans that have managed to reconcile the need to reduce construction carbon to zero while promoting significant numbers for new dwellings, their servicing and associated infrastructure?
Yeah, thanks. I can't name any offhand, but I think there are. I have seen policies that look at construction emissions and try to impose a policy that is as effective and strong as possible on that issue. Yeah, I think it's an important aspect. I think it's something that the Green Building Council has done some really good work on, and I'm sure there's lots of good practice out there. But unfortunately, I don't have anything to hand to point to. But yeah, it's a good point to raise.
Yeah, Emma.
I'd probably recommend having a look at the outputs from LETI, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, and they've got an embodied carbon primer, which is quite a useful document to look at, and it includes some questions that you can be asking of applicants to look at how they're looking at driving down emissions associated with construction. So quite useful to look at.
Good place to start, thank you. Next question for James. So do you think COVID and the remote working enforcement over the last 9 months could possibly help kickstart reductions in the need to travel?
The need to travel is a difficult one, because I suspect quite a lot of our travel is not driven by need, it's driven by desire. It's about seeing the way we live differently and embracing that. So yes, partly COVID would have given us insights. I mean, it looks like we're all sitting at home rather than in the office today. But I think it would be foolish just to rest on the thought that we've had a nudge. I think we need to actually place systems and policies in place that will bring forward new forms of development that absolutely hardwire this in and make it the best choice, rather than it's just something we do at the corner of how we already organise our lives.
Thank you. I'm aware I am actually just directing these questions at individuals, but if there's anyone else on the panel that wants to chip in with a penny's worth, feel free to sort of just let me know. Next question I've got is for Emma. So do you think that planning has enough leverage to deliver expectations in terms of carbon reduction, given the reliance on factors outside of direct control?
I think planning does have the leverage. We've got a lot of legislative context for why we should be responding to net zero carbon. And I think if any of you have had the letter from Client Earth, that's a really good letter to be taking information from, because it sets some of that context for you. There are challenges. So we know that governments are looking to repeal elements of the Planning and Energy Act. But I think we've got a very strong case to be making, given the legislative context, given the Paris Agreement. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I think whoever is first to go through examination of these new style of policies is almost kind of going to be setting the bar for a lot of other local authorities. But we've had some positive results in the last few years. Reading have adopted a net zero carbon policy recently. So I think there's some good examples out there that if you've got that strong evidence base and you can clearly set out why it is that you're doing this, you've done the viability work, then I think, you know, there is a very strong basis for us, you know, doing a lot more and responding to the climate emergency.
I think I'd be really keen to see the good practice examples when they come through the system, because I think so far we've seen people attempting it and developers' reactions to it. If it's not sort of based on any evidence, it is tend to be a rough road over. Another question for Sam, please. Are there any examples of litigation for failure to comply with duty under the section 19(1)(a)?
No, so I think one of the problems has been, I suppose, a lack of understanding and awareness of that duty, and that's something we've tried to improve. And I think, I mean, obviously, one of the sort of issues commonly cited is that there's a lot of pressure coming from the development industry in terms of the threat of appeal and legal challenge. And I think what our work is trying to do is to try and balance that so that there's proper enforcement of these existing requirements that are actually, when they're fully complied with, can be quite transformative, or at least you know, a good starting point on a journey towards transformative planning. And I think, yeah, and so I'm not aware of any cases having been brought since we started raising this issue. But I think there is some consensus emerging around the fact that this requirement clearly you need to do more than simply have a policy called climate change, or policies that have an impact on climate change. You need to have some form of justification to show that they're adequate. And so, yeah, that's the requirement that needs to be front and centre from the outset of the plan making process.
Perfect, thank you. Isabella, how does a local planning authority actually monitor some of the example indicators, and is the data source, is it updated annually?
So I think that is referring to the measuring planning outcomes work that we did with Kevin Murray Associates. So if you go onto our website, you'll be able to download the spreadsheet. I haven't used it. It's not something that we update annually. It's something that's mapped against the different sustainable development goals. So if you can put in specific policies for your local plan, and you can see how they match up to reaching that development goal. Unfortunately, we don't update that annually. But the sustainable development test, there might be some outcomes that come through there, or the revised NPPF, there might be some kind of more clear outcomes that the government comes up with to measure against.
Thank you. I think this one might be Sam, James and Emma actually. What work is being done to address existing housing stock? Because there was lots of talk about new construction and new plans and new standards. What about retrofitting and the existing housing stock we've got? So Emma first, and then James, and then Sam, please.
This is quite an interesting one. We've tried in our existing Cambridge local plan to tackle the existing stock through introducing a consequential improvements policy. But that policy is proving really difficult to implement because it requires the use of planning conditions And I'm told by our development management officers that they can't use planning conditions for works that aren't associated with the purpose of the original planning application. So I think, you know, it's an area that I think I need to look in the energy white paper to see if it's being addressed. But my strong feeling is that retrofit and consequential improvements needs to come back into building regulations. That's where it was supposed to be until it was removed by Eric Pickles a number of years back. But I think there are roles for local authorities. So one of the things that we're considering at the moment for Cambridge is whether we produce a retrofit handbook for, you know, typical typologies across our area to kind of show residents, you know, these are some of the things that you can do. This is how much it costs, and taking a whole house approach.
Lovely. James?
Yeah, I think I would agree with Emma that it's very difficult to pursue this through planning, but in the Devon carbon plan, it's been a very strong discussion that it's very much an issue for local authority activity. And some of the focus has been, how can our local authorities create a sort of local market in retrofit? I mean, retrofit is massively important. Instead of the retrofit measures being essentially done by larger companies, can we create local markets? Can we create local systems? And there's a Dutch approach called Energy Sprong, which my colleague Ian on Hudscott on the task force is leading on, to kickstart a kind of local retrofit industry that then will become doesn't require support once it starts to scale up. So probably not so much a planning issue. I completely understand the limits that Emma explains, but very much a key target for local authority action more widely, and particularly around economic development as well. I mean, for the Southwest, if we can do it ourselves rather than have it imported, that's really important.
I guess local authorities leading by example in terms of any sort of affordable housing stock would be a good starter in terms of getting local motivation up. Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the inherent limitations in terms of the ability of planning to compel retrofit. I think you sometimes see policies looking at major renovations that involve the need for planning permission, using conditions in a seemingly quite productive way to require some form of retrofit across the wider development. And I think also it's worth just reflecting the fact, that new buildings can have quite a helpful indirect influence on retrofit levels, where you have really good quality, high standard new build that can, actually improve people's perception of these standards and incentivize people to want to invest in retrofitting their properties. So, yeah, maybe more of an indirect effect often rather than an indirect.
Lovely. I think, Isabel, there was a question, I think I found it quite surprising in your presentation in terms of the amount estimated in terms of implementing the improvements set out in the white paper and the subsequent reduction in the value that's actually been put forward to try and push forward the measures through. So I think the question that's come through is just, what can we do to convince the local councillors to invest in robust evidence and research on climate change for local plans, because basically you need their buy-in to fund the studies to ensure you've got the right evidence base to inform local policy?
Yeah, I think it's about kind of creating, it's sad, but creating that economic case for investing in climate measures. And some of the tools which I mentioned are quite good at that in terms of quantifying the economic benefits. The Invest and Prosper report as well, there's some really useful statistics in there of the real kind of economic benefits that planning can bring in terms of quantifying the health benefits and putting a monetary value on that, quantifying the emissions reduction benefits and putting a value on that. So, citing some of these statistics is probably useful. But yeah, I think it's about creating that kind of economic case for investing in climate, unfortunately.
Thank you. Sam, did you have a perspective on that, given the Climate Earth drive for everyone to update local plans?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously incredibly encouraging to see authorities like Greater Cambridge commissioning this evidence base and doing this really thorough analysis. It's incredibly helpful and important. I think also, though, it may be that where resources don't stretch to that level of analysis, that there are helpful rules of thumb, if you like, that can be gained from quite authoritative analysis that's been done by others. And sometimes when others have done that work, you can base your own assumptions and assessments on what they've done. So I say, you know, where there's a lack of resources, I still think there's an incredible amount of opportunity to improve policy. But obviously, I think where possible, the more analysis and the more you know, detailed that analysis can be, the better, and it's going to lead to improved outcomes.
Yeah, and more information that's about increasing information sharing, which should improve everything for everyone. I think this is the last question I'm going to come to. So it's for Emma. Given the all-encompassing area of climate change, what should be the key components in a robust and proportionate evidence base? Bit of a big one, sorry.
So some of the key outputs of the work that we're looking at, there's the kind of the technical analysis, so the technical feasibility of getting to net zero carbon, I think is really important. And the way that Bioregional are doing that and Etude is that they're looking at a range of kind of typical development typologies and working out, right, this is technically how, you know, this is where they are now, this is how you get them up to net zero carbon. You need to have that feasibility work. And I would suggest that if you're looking at consultants to, not feasibility, sorry, viability work. And I think if you're looking at consultants to do that viability work, I think you want to make sure that they've got good experience of doing costings of enhanced measures for sustainability. So we're actually working with Curry and Brown on that aspect of work. So I think it's looking at the technical feasibility. It is also looking at that kind of economic viability as well. What I would say in terms of those authorities who perhaps don't have the resource to put into this, there is some good resources out there to kind of show you model planning policies already. So UK Green Building Council have got their policy playbook. Good Homes Alliance are looking at doing some work on model planning policies for net zero carbon. And some of that will kind of give you indications of what evidence you need and what work was carried out in the background to support that. I'm also happy to share, you know, our tender documents and so forth for our net zero carbon work if anyone's interested in that and is thinking, oh my God, where do we start on commissioning some evidence base? So I think reaching out to other local authorities, but yeah, it's that feasibility and viability, which I think is quite important, and also doing some life cycle analysis. This stuff isn't about short-term economic gain, it's, you know, longer term benefits. So looking at some of that life cycle costing, I think, is really important as well.
Thank you. James, did you have anything to add from that from your perspective?
Yes, I would say beware of inherited assumptions, particularly around settlement hierarchy. The work I did for the Countryside Agency over 15 years ago now showed the settlement hierarchy was oversimplistic, and actually how places really performed in sustainability terms was really much more varied and much more to do with networks than standalone qualities of a place. Now take all of that, put it to one side, and then add the thought that it's a very reasonable frame now for planning to think, where can I take these places to in terms of a net zero solution for them? i.e. what are opportunities, what are constraints, rather than just what are they now, because we know across the board that what they are now is not enough to get us to net zero. So we really need to change the lens and think about, how do I take these places somewhere else? And to do that, it's the old joke, you need to understand where they are now. The old joke is, how do I get to so and so? Well, I wouldn't start from here. You have to know where you're starting from.
Lovely, thank you. I think that's it for the question. So thank you very much. I just want to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers for their presentations and their time today, and everyone that's still dialed in, thank you for attending. I think this year has been strange in terms of circumstances and has put many people outside of their comfort zone. But I think the importance of climate change and carbon reduction has never been so clear, particularly with Earthshot, the Global Environmental Prize, and the Plant Up Britain, to encourage thought and action on how we can make a difference. I think for us in this profession and as a plan-led system, it is important how we can make the best difference we can. I think thank you for your time, and thank you again for the speakers. I wish you all the best going forward, and I would encourage you to be brave, be bold, and be brilliant. Thank you very much.